Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining this webinar by the Global Global Research and Development Partnership, or GARDP, as most of you know us as. I am Jen Schneider, and I'll be hosting and moderating this webinar on advancing antibiotic R&D during the COVID pandemic. As everyone on this call knows, 2020 was a very challenging year for people around the globe. It revealed a lot of vulnerabilities in our various healthcare systems and in our ability to nimbly respond to a public health emergency. 2021 is forcing us to take stock of global health disparities. Some countries are awash in vaccines and therapeutics and are struggling to reach those who are vaccine hesitant. Other countries are waiting for these critical vaccines to reach their populations in a meaningful way. The COVID pandemic has also driven home the reality that those of us who work in the infectious disease community have long understood, which is that infectious diseases really know no boundaries, and countries need to work in global partnership to better address the impact of these diseases across all countries and in all families. As we think about the silent pandemic of antibiotic resistance, we at GARDP are focused on bridging the gap between innovation and access by working on the development of candidates in late-stage clinical development and access. This requires identifying the barriers to access and finding innovative ways to overcome them. We are also exploring ways to ensure that there is a viable market and sustainable supply of treatments in the long term. To address the growing antibiotic resistance crisis, GARDP has set the 5 by 25 goal, which seeks to deliver 5 new treatments by 2025 for drug-resistant infections that pose the greatest threat to health and economic security. Seamus will provide an overview of key GARDP achievements in the past year. So with this global perspective in mind, I'm pleased to have representatives from 3 different countries and on 3 different continents joining us for the webinar today. This webinar will highlight efforts to advance antibiotic R&D in the midst of the pandemic and consider the importance of investing in the development of new and improved treatments for drug-resistant infections. We have Seamus O'Brien, GARDP's R&D Director, who is in the UK, Chris Burns, President and CEO of Venatorx, somewhere in the US, I believe, and Kamini Walia, Senior Scientist at ICMR, who is joining the discussion from India. Oops. Sorry, I think we need to back the slides up a bit. There we go. So the organization of today's webinar is to begin with presentations, followed by a panel discussion and audience Q&A. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar via the questions window in your window control panel as shown on this slide. If your question is addressed to a specific speaker, please include their name when submitting the question, and we will work to address these questions after the presentation and respond to as many as possible. So with that, I will turn it over to Seamus.
Okay, thank you, Jen, for the introduction, and let me just add my greetings to everybody wherever you are based. Thank you for dialing in today. So I'm going to give you an overview of GARDP's R&D programs, and in particular, an update on the progress of our program and the impact of the COVID pandemic on our key projects and studies, and how we've attempted to manage and mitigate against the impact of the pandemic. Just building on what Jen said in her introduction, we are an independent foundation focused on working in partnership to address and hopefully accelerate both the development and delivery of antibiotic treatments for priority drug-resistant infections. We were formed in 2016. We're a direct output of the WHO's AMR action plan. We were initially incubated within the Drugs and Neglected Disease Initiative and became independent with our own full governance in 2019. Our goal is to bring together public and private sectors to develop new treatments for bacterial infections and to ensure responsible and sustainable access, addressing the public health impacts of antibiotic resistance. Okay, it's working, great. So why do we need GARDP? Jen touched on this already, but I'll just add a little bit to this. So fundamentally, we still have the scenario of increasing levels of drug-resistant infections and a lack of safe and effective treatment options. And that is because there is generally a lack of access to existing antibiotics. The R&D pipeline is not addressing the priority gaps with enough optimal new chemical entities, and there is a lack of evidence to support your priority. There's a lack of access to existing antibiotics. There's a lack of evidence to support the appropriate use of antibiotics that we do have. And this impact is exacerbated in priority populations, the elderly in hospitals, patients with comorbidities, children, newborn babies, and it does impact the sexual and reproductive health in women. And this impact is even more so for those populations in resource-constrained settings. And this is a public health challenge leading to a public health crisis. So GARDP is focusing on building a public health orientated portfolio through global public and private partners. We take on various roles. We can be an investor, leveraging public and private funding in a broad development and delivery agreements that have clear public health value. We can take on a lead development role, sponsor clinical studies, and lead pharmaceutical development activities, or we can take on a co-development role where we will have complementary skills to our partners. And we can lead and co-lead access solutions. Overall, we will share the costs and risks in antibiotic development. We will look to go beyond that milestone of regulatory approval via sustainable access pathways, which need to be underpinned by sustainable reimbursement models. We have an ambitious goal of 5 treatments across these 4 program areas addressing infections in priority populations caused by the WHO priority pathogens. So this is how we are set up within our R&D organization. Our priority in GARDP R&D is antibiotic development and delivery to patients, primarily patient phase clinical development, and also pharmaceutical development of both clinical trial investigational medicinal products and final drug product for the clinic. We have a discrete focus on antibiotic discovery and exploratory research and preclinical evaluation. We are developing access solutions where we start in our development programs, but also access solutions for antibiotics in the global pipeline outside of the GARDP portfolio. And part of those access pathways, we wish to address the sustainable access of antibiotics underpinned by strategies based on appropriate and optimal use. And the Secure initiative is one example of an access solution for the global antibiotic needs that we are following. We have an extensive scientific affairs program of activities, in particular Revive, our knowledge building and educational outreach program for the antibiotic R&D community that has really thrived during the pandemic. And unfortunately, however, I don't have the opportunity to go through that today in this presentation. So these are our 4 priority clinical program areas containing a number of clinical development projects and studies. Firstly, I'll start off with serious bacterial infections. These are those healthcare-associated infections in adults most impacted by antibiotic resistance, leading to significant morbidity and mortality. They also impact the practice and delivery of healthcare globally. Our focus here is on those infections caused by the priority pathogens, such as carbapenem-resistant enterobacteriales, carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter baumannii, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. We launched our first project within this program with Venatorx Pharmaceuticals, an example of a key partnership with a biotech, and Chris maybe will explain some of the focus for Venatorx Pharmaceuticals later. The program here is to work with Venatorx to develop Celepime Taniborbactam, a beta-lactamase inhibitor with the potential to treat infections caused by those most clinically relevant CREs and carbapenem-resistant Pseudomonas aeruginosa, for which there are very limited treatment options. This is also a program supported by currently and in the past by the US government, BARDA, NIAID, and also the Wellcome Trust. And GARDP is now joining this collaboration, investing to support the pivotal phase 3 efficacy and safety study in complicated UTI, and also partnering to deliver evidence to treat patients with those drug-resistant infections of interest. And also, as I'll mention next, to develop this antibiotic to treat infections in children. So children are a priority population for GARDP with 2 programs under the headline or banner of children's antibiotics. Firstly, there is the Pediatric Development Program. This is focused on the regulatory development of antibiotics, both new and existing or recovered antibiotics, and the studies required to confirm a safe and effective dose for these antibiotics for children of all ages. So we really want to work with partners, companies on the overall development programs for their antibiotics, but also to accelerate the development of antibiotics for serious bacterial infections in children for which there are limited or no treatment options. This program is a bridge for us between our SBI program and the neonatal sepsis program. As where appropriate, we do want to evaluate these antibiotics as candidates for infections in neonates, particularly in geographies where there is high and emerging resistance. And our first project here is co-leading the pediatric development plan with Venatorx for Celepime Taniborbactam. So if we move on to neonatal sepsis, our focus for neonatal sepsis is to develop alternative regimens for the treatment of clinically diagnosed neonatal sepsis, which is a serious bacterial infection with considerable impact on mortality. Our initial focus here is to understand the management and treatment and the impact of antibiotic resistance on that treatment and outcomes for babies with sepsis. And we've done this so far through the conduct of a large prospective observational study, which I'll talk about shortly. We've also been focusing on selecting alternative regimens of generic antibiotics through very thorough PK/PD evaluation, clinical PK studies where appropriate, and safety assessments also. Moving on to sexually transmitted infections, our primary focus here is to deliver a treatment for gonorrhea that is resistant to standards of care, and to cover, where possible, the syndrome of urogenital infections. Our leading project is our development agreement with Entasis Therapeutics to develop the zoliflodacin, initially for uncomplicated gonorrhea. GARDP here is responsible for clinical development, pharmaceutical development activities, and a public health focused access pathway for a large number of territories. So I apologize, there's a lot of text on this slide. I'll try to go through some of the key achievements that we've we've reached over the last 2 years. It's really very much a condensed summary of our activities against the backdrop of an emerging and volatile pandemic that we've all faced over the last 15 to 16 months. For the Serious Bacterial Infections program, we kicked off the collaboration with Venatorx at the beginning of Q2 2020. Chris, I'm sure, will let you know of the progress and challenges faced by Venatorx over the last 15 or 16 months. Our focus has been on supporting the conduct of the main pivotal phase 3 and also developing an observational study to assess the feasibility of conducting investigations to evaluate the efficacy of Celepime Taniborbactam to treat those infections which are either confirmed or highly suspected to be due to those priority pathogens, carbapenem-resistant infections as an example, and to understand how those infections are currently managed in 2 key countries, India and South Africa. We now have got a synopsis approved by our advisory committee, and we are building small networks with our partners, the Indian Council for Medical Research and the South African Medical Research Council, and we're identifying up to 5 sites per country, which will go forward for both the observational study and hopefully the interventional study. For children's antibiotics, we've been delighted to work with Venatorx also to secure an agreed pediatric development plans with both the FDA and EMA last year for Celepime Taniborbactam, with the first studies, actually a juvenile toxicology study, already completed. We've also focusing on developing an existing generic antibiotic, polymyxin B, as a last resort option for infections in children for which there are no option. Now, this is really a challenging proposition as it requires the ability to ensure a regulatory and access pathway for a generic antibiotic where one doesn't currently exist, in addition to demonstrating the clinical and safety and efficacy of this antibiotic. Unfortunately, we've not been able to proceed with the pediatric plan for polymyxin B, as an example, as we've not been able yet to secure a partnership yet to address the access requirements. So this project is currently under review. So for neonatal sepsis, this year, well, last year I should say, we are able to complete the very large neonatal observational study despite the impact of COVID, providing this study over 3,000 patients in 19 sites across 11 countries, was completed in August with a database lock, and the main manuscript was submitted for publication in June this year. Now, this study is providing key information on the clinical outcomes, management, antibiotic treatments, pathogen involvement, and resistance to current antibiotic regimens for neonatal sepsis in these countries. Now, this is a great achievement, we believe, considering the impact of COVID, and our partners, St. George's University of London, Penta, and also MRC Clinical Trials, we've been working very closely to complete this study and to look at the outputs of this, which are now influencing the design of a groundbreaking study, which is going to look at ranking a range of treatment regimens for the treatment of neonatal sepsis in one large randomized clinical trial. These treatments will include 3 antibiotic regimens selected by GARDP. They will be based on a PK/PD evaluation, which we've now completed, of 3 antibiotics: fosomycin, flumexef, and amikacin. And we look forward to moving forward with this study in this year and next year. The STI program, the zoliflodacin project, I should say, was entering into a pivotal period of starting the phase 3 clinical trial and progressing on the pathway to validate the manufacturing process for the final drug product. The impact of the pandemic hitting in March 2020 was really significant on the phase 3, with an immediate pause on recruitment that lasted 3 months, and a similar, if not longer, delay on activation of new sites in countries such as South Africa and Thailand. We were able to restart recruitment in June 2020 in an ongoing COVID scenario, which I will talk to shortly. And we have now activated all sites in South Africa and Thailand, and all sites are now recruiting against a background of what is really a volatile, unpredictable pandemic in all countries, but particularly in those 2 countries currently. Our contract manufacturing organization based in India has been a key partner for us on our project, and they've been able to address key process improvement issues for the drug product manufacturing campaign against a significant impact of COVID on business continuity for the organization. We've also been able to progress with our first evidence generating activities for our access pathway, with the drafting and approval of 2 STI prevalence studies, working with the WHO and the Ministries of Health in Kenya and Thailand, respectively. Okay, we also have a small discrete discovery and exploratory research program focusing on both the screening of underexploited compound libraries and also exploratory research focused on novelty in terms of bacterial targets and modes of action of the antibacterial compounds, also focusing on the WHO's critical and high priority pathogen list, and generally working where others are not currently active. This funnel diagram demonstrates the range of projects, including the AMR screening consortium with 3 Japanese companies, Takeda, Eisai, and Daiichi Sankyo, and the number of compounds that have been screened, leading to 3 hit series, as we call them, which will be further profiled and evaluated. This activity, supported by the Institute of Pasteur in Korea, has been able to make significant progress in spite of the pandemic. So this is an overview of both the projects and antibiotic assets under evaluation in the form of a pipeline slide. I've talked about a lot of this already, so I won't dwell on it too much. Our discovery focus is very much aligned with our serious bacterial infections disease area program. What I really want to point out here, there are 2 key activities in phase 3 with the Celepime Taniborbactam UTI phase 3 study and the zoliflodacin gonorrhea study. Both those programs, we're already starting to map out and undertake activities focusing on access. And then in the neonatal sepsis project, we're moving forward with the final evaluation of the 3 candidate antibiotics, which will go into the strategic efficacy and safety trial, which will commence next year. Okay, so I guess we're all sick of hearing and talking about COVID, but if you can bear with me over the next slide, I'll just reflect on the impact of COVID on our activities overall, specifically mention the impact of COVID on the treatment of sexually transmitted infections and our clinical studies in that area, steps we've had to take and we will need to continue to take to mitigate against the impact. So I can assure you're all aware that clinical projects and studies have been most impacted, with significant reduction in feasibility assessments, the ability to do site setups, and then obviously recruitment, with overall delays in forecasted and anticipated study durations. Thankfully for us, our discovery research has been minimally impacted, and also our scientific affairs activities have significantly increased. So how was this impact of COVID demonstrated at the level of the study? Well, in the first lockdown, it was impossible for sites to operate with the restrictions on staff mobility as being the major factor. When sites reopened, there was really, what we saw then was an impact on patients seeking treatment or being able to be identified for treatment and lack of willingness to consent for obvious reasons, particularly those studies which would involve extra visits. We also had to accept that activities may have to be delayed if there was any possible impact on safety or quality. As the COVID impact was moving forward, staff were being redeployed in countries for COVID activities, and this is currently still happening, leading to under-resourcing for all our R&D activities, including ours. Very much in the wave 2 or 3 later in the year in 2020, what we saw was a really significant worldwide shortage in reagents, supply, and diagnostics, and redeployment of many of those for COVID needs. And this is something which has got better, but we still need to keep an eye on. Now, all of this impact leads to an increase in costs from an overall extension of your sort of baseline operational costs, but also the cost to put in place mitigations. I just want to reflect very quickly on the impact of COVID on the treatment of sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections as an example of a community-based public health issue. These quotes are from the National STD Directors Group in the US. Unfortunately, there is no such summary data available from other countries, but I think it's really impactful just to focus and dwell on this. This group of STDs, they run the treatment programs in the US, and they come up with what are called field reports, and they've been doing this via COVID, and this report is from January 2021. This quote outlines the fundamental impact on the identification and treatment of STD, never mind the ability to conduct clinical research. So this pivoting back and forth from STI to COVID and back again due to the volatile nature of the pandemic has resulted in significant impact on STD services with significant burnout of staff with a reduction of between 20 to 30% in services. And that's an important component of the impact of the COVID on clinical research in this area. Okay, so this is I just wanted to just finish on a couple of slides. This slide is really focusing on the impact of COVID at the level of the zoliflodacin phase 3 study and what we saw. We really described it in 4 stages. The first stage 1 was the immediate impact of lockdown, and our focus was very there, mitigation of missed visits. Stage 2 was moving on. How could we reintroduce recruitment? What adaptations and amendments could we look to take? Stage 3 and 4 is where we currently are now, really. What criteria do we need to put in place to successfully relaunch the study and also to activate and open new sites in a new COVID framework? And then how would we support and continue recruitment in a volatile COVID framework or backdrop? And our focus has been right at the beginning from stage 1, obviously pausing recruitment, working with ethics regulators, supporting completion of and ensuring the integrity of the primary endpoint, supporting completion of patients focusing on our test of cure assessment, replacing other in-person follow-up visits which were not absolutely necessary by putting in place planned protocol deviations, consulting the guidance. We then decided not to go forward with specific amendments, but to introduce adaptations working very closely with our sites on what we call a relaunch strategy. So to how to conduct the study during a COVID-19 pandemic. So investigators were encouraged to interpret the exclusion criteria and then implement local guidance to address pre-screening, testing, and adaptation site procedures for COVID. As the trial sponsor, GARDP approved these in conjunction with the site teams for each site resuming and also new sites starting enrollment since the pandemic has hit us. So that's where we are now, and we're continuing to support recruitment in all our current sites and reforecasting based on a study conduct ongoing through a very variable COVID-19 scenario. I think it's important for us to adapt. So high quality global clinical research continues to be possible. We have to adapt to changing environments, and I think it's beholden on us, and GARDP is very committed to this to ensure we continue access to gonorrhea diagnosis and treatment, and we continue to access and evaluate, I should say, new treatments, because we do believe this is a global health priority. And our focus going forward is to really continue now to deploy these sustainable mitigations in the face of a volatile pandemic, which is heterogeneous and variable in its nature from country to country. As Jennifer mentioned, vaccine inequity absolutely needs to be addressed to support countries who are disproportionately impacted. And we are carefully monitoring and working with those countries, particularly South Africa and Thailand, who are now making a significant impact on the feasibility setup and recruitment in our studies. And this is an ongoing scenario as they are now facing new waves. Okay, I'll finish now just very briefly, giving you a bit of a snapshot of our focus for 2021 and beyond. I don't really have the time to read through this in detail. We will be continuing to build on the encouraging progress we have seen with recruitment in our zoliflodacin phase 3 study. We will progress pediatric development activities for new assets, and in particular, Celepime Taniborbactam. Developing the protocol and the setup for the groundbreaking neosepsis study, which will evaluate the treatment of clinically diagnosed sepsis in neonates, and starting the feasibility and observational studies to prepare to generate evidence for the treatment of difficult to treat resistant infections with Celepime Taniborbactam. We will continue to consolidate and improve our revive activities and identify new hits and transition compounds from screening to more broader projects within our discovery and exploratory research activities. And I'd just like to finish by thanking all the GARDP R&D team, wherever they're located in the globe. I'd really like to strongly thank our partners, including our sites, and also I'd like to thank our donors for continually supporting our work. So thank you. I hope I haven't run over time.
Thank you, Seamus. We will next hear from Chris.
So hello, Chris Burns here. I'm the president and CEO and one of the founders of Venatorx Pharmaceuticals, which Seamus has been kind enough to mention a number of times earlier in the discussion. I wanted to first thank the organizers from GARDP and Jen Schneider for hosting, as well as the GARDP team, which has proven to be a tremendous partner as we try to advance our lead asset all the way to approval. I have 3 slides here. The first introduces the company. The company began in 2010 with 3 of us, 3 founders. We like to say we were in a local bakery with a laptop, no assets, no money, no equipment. But we wrote an NIH grant. We got it funded, and we began a small lab operation. Fast forward 11 years. And here we are now. So we have over 80 employees, 3 compounds in the clinic, 2 facilities outside of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and we hope to be a key player going forward in this area. Let's just see. There's a little bit of a lag. There we go. So this is our portfolio. Seamus has mentioned the lead product, the intravenous agent Celepime plus Taniborbactam, a beta-lactamase inhibitor combination. This compound is in phase 3. We expect it will finish in Q4 of this year with top-line data at the end of the year or in January of next year. We were hit by COVID pretty hard for all the reasons that Seamus mentioned. Everything from difficulty bringing patients into the hospital for the treatment or for the follow-up visits, all the things you can imagine, supply chain disruptions, lack of being able to get monitors into clinical sites at the hospital, just about anything you can imagine. We, like many others, suffered last year. But we're back up and running, and we're feeling very good that this trial will end this year. This is a best-in-class intravenous agent for gram-negative infections, and I have a final slide that sort of puts it into some context. Behind that, through these single ascending dose and multiple ascending dose parts of phase 1 is a second agent. It's also a beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitor combination. It's ceftibuten plus Venatorx 7145. So this is positioned to be a best-in-class oral agent for gram-negative infections, covers ESBL infections, can cover serine carbapenemase infections, and is looking really good so far. So we're very enthusiastic about that product, and that is supported by the NIH. After that, we have a variety of other products inside and outside of infectious diseases, all heavily supported by U.S. government grants and contracts, but we won't go into those today. The final slide, just to try to put into some context, the drug combination that Seamus mentioned that we are collaborating with GARDP on, and that's Celepime plus Taniborbactam. This is a very simplistic slide, but it's just to give some context. Gram-negative infections often engender resistance by the production of beta-lactamase enzymes, and these enzymes chew up beta-lactam antibiotics, and so they, at some point, even very good beta-lactam antibiotics like meropenem and other carbapenems start to generate their own level of resistance, and of course we call those carbapenemases and carbapenem-resistant infections. So you can see the top line there. You have meropenem, which is generically available throughout the world and is being heavily used, no longer creating beta-lactamase enzymes either in the serine family or the metallo family. And there's no check mark next to those because they are resistant. And then you have a new suite of agents such as Avicaz in the US, branded as Zavicefta, ex-US, with AbbVie and Pfizer, very good serine beta-lactamase inhibitors and able to play an important role for carbapenem-resistant infections, but lack activity against metallo beta-lactamases. And then you have Celepime Taniborbactam. Taniborbactam is the only late-stage beta-lactamase inhibitor that can potently inhibit both serine and metallo beta-lactamases. And so in combination with Celepime, you finally get the full coverage of spectrum across the family. This is why we've brought in a lot of the support we've gotten from GARDP, Wellcome Trust, BARDA, NIH, et cetera. I believe that's all I have to introduce the company, and I think I'll turn it, back over to Jen.
Great, thanks for that overview, Chris. And now we will turn the slides over to Kamini.
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are joining from. I will be giving you a brief overview of the antimicrobial resistance initiative of the Indian Council of Medical Research and the activities that we have been undertaking in India. Indian Council of Medical Research is a nodal body for undertaking medical research in India. And the AMR initiative of ICMR started in 2012 or 13 when we set up one of the first surveillance networks in the country to monitor the yearly trends and patterns of AMR and provide both the phenotypic antimicrobial susceptibility testing data as well as undertake the genotypic characterization of drug-resistant strains. So the purpose of this was to generate nationally representative data of international quality, which can give us understanding of what is happening in the country. Because before that, there was a lot of data which was being generated, but none of them could be collated to generate the nationally representative trends because different labs were using different methodologies. Now, in 2015, we further added to it the infection prevention activities to capture the data on hospital-acquired infections, build capacities for infection control, and with an overarching aim to create a workforce for infection prevention in the tertiary care hospitals. Antimicrobial stewardship program was started by ICMR in 2018 with the aim to establish the structure and process of antimicrobial stewardship in Indian hospitals. We had undertaken a brief survey in 2013 and 14, and we found that even the basic structure of antimicrobial stewardship is not available in the tertiary care hospitals. The idea also was to capture antimicrobial consumption and implement strategies for antimicrobial stewardship whenever these hospitals were ready. As Seamus described in his presentation, since the stewardship work was started in 2018 and 19, this definitely took a hit when there was a COVID outbreak because of multiple reasons, like staff being diverted to COVID activities, and a lot of non-COVID treatment came to a standstill, and most of the hospitals were converted into COVID wards. Yet, the data that we captured even from the COVID patients on antimicrobial use and the way the secondary infections spread in the COVID patients was alarming. So this is what the Indian network looks like. It is a mix of a government and the private sector hospitals. Almost 30 hospitals report data to the ICMR network. And we focus on these 6 pathogens, which is Enterobacteriaceae, gram-negative non-fermenters, enteric fever organisms, diarrheagenic organisms, gram-positives, including MRSA and Enterococcus. And we also have a focus on fungal pathogens. Fungal pathogens, although there is a limited capacity to undertake mycology work in Indian hospitals, yet a lot of hospitals experience fungal outbreaks which are not noticed because of the absence of mycological facilities in these hospitals. Now, if I have to tell you the trends that we have captured in last 4 to 5 years, we see that 70 to 80% of infections are constituted by gram-negatives. And it was really heartening to see that in Chris's presentation, there was a focus on new treatments for gram-negative infections, which are urgently needed in India. Because the ESBL rates are as high as 70 to 80% in E. coli and Klebsiella pneumoniae. The carbapenem rates have been increasing by 5 to 10% for last 3 to 4 years that we have been monitoring. And we found something like 90% resistance to Acinetobacter pneumoniae in COVID patients. Although for non-COVID data, it is around 70% for Acinetobacter, yet it is increasing in Klebsiella pneumoniae to alarming levels of about 50%. There is also increasing MIC to colistin, yet the resistance to colistin has remained within limits, and very few centers are reporting colistin resistance. Salmonella typhi, we are seeing increasing resistance to fluoroquinolones, yet it remains sensitive to the first-line drugs as well, which is ampicillin, chloramphenicol, cotramoxazole, as well as cefixime. Gram-positives, almost 40% of gram-positives that we isolate as MRSA, and now we are seeing increasing MICs to tigecycline and linezolid. Enterococcus faecium and faecalis are becoming difficult bugs to treat because vancomycin resistance is high in both of these bugs, almost 3 times higher in faecium as compared to faecalis. Glycopeptide resistance in last 2 years has increased from 15% to almost 30%, and we also see phosphomycin resistance at 12%. We are also seeing 30 to 40% resistance to caspofungin and fluconazole, which is a first-line drug for treatment of candida in fungal infections. We publish this data every year. We also bring about treatment guideline, but this is data which is coming from tertiary care hospitals only, and it should not be extrapolated to community settings. We also closely monitor the evolution of gram-negative pathogens through genotypic characterization like PCR, site-directed sequencing, targeted sequencing, or even a whole genome sequencing. And there have been some very interesting findings that we saw a shift from NDM to OXA48 in 2017 in Klebsiella pneumoniae. We also saw convergence of AMR as well as the virulence factors on plasmid ink H1B in Klebsiella pneumoniae in 2020. Now that most of the infections that we saw in COVID patients were of Klebsiella pneumoniae, and the bug has acquired virulence factors as well as has acquired a lot of antimicrobial resistance genes. This is a very difficult bug to treat in Indian hospitals and is comprising almost 40-50% of infections that we see in especially in the hospital acquired infections. And the Klebsiella pneumoniae carbamazes in Klebsiella pneumoniae is also very different from what we see globally. Globally, we see a lot of KPCs, we see a lot of NDM, but in India we have basically NDM and OXA48 group of carbamazes. So the drugs which will be required to treat these infections which are caused by these pathogens are going to be different from what the other countries are going to need. So this slide basically summarizes how effective are the new drugs which are now available in the market or are soon going to be available, how effective these will be against the carbamazes which we see in India. For example, the first generation PL, PLI, they will be able to treat ESBLs, but they will not be able to treat AMCs and the carbamazes. Ceftazidime avibactam will not be effective again against the KPC3 or the MBL, which is the NDM which we see in our country. Meropenem vaprobactam will not be effective against the NDM and OXA48 like other OXAs, which is 23, 24, and 58, which we have recently isolated. Imipenem relebactam is again not effective against these carbamazes. Similarly, meropenem nacubactam is effective against the ESBLs, AMC, and the KPC, but is not effective against the carbamazes which we see in Indian patients. So this actually asks for chasing the new drug development, because we haven't seen new class of drug developing and being introduced in the Indian market in last almost 2 to 3 decades. So although the new drug development is very important and it should be a very important part of containment of antimicrobial resistance, but it has to be supported by evidence which will come through the surveillance systems like we have set up, and WHO is now motivating all the countries to set up antimicrobial surveillance systems through WHO GLASS initiative. The other most important aspect of introducing new drugs will be to have effective stewardship, which encourages the responsible and rational antimicrobial prescriptions. It comes through the hospitals, it comes at the level of prescription, it also comes at the level of regulation, so that the regulations support rationalizing and responsible antimicrobial prescription to prevent the misuse of new antimicrobials. Piperacillin tazobactam, which was introduced about a decade back, we are almost seeing 60 to 70% resistance in tertiary care hospitals. So this paints a very grim and an alarming scenario that if new drugs are introduced and there is not effective stewardship at the level of the country, they are also likely to be misused, and we will again lose good candidate to improper and misuse of antimicrobials. So ICMR recently entered into MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, to collaborate towards development of new drugs and undertake clinical trials for new drugs which the GARDP is focusing on. As you heard from Seamus' presentation, the priorities of GARDP pretty much align with the ICMR's priorities in terms of gonorrhea, neonatal sepsis, as well as gram-negative infections, which are a problem in our country, and GARDP is trying to bring new treatment for these syndromes. Neonatal sepsis is particularly important for India. Almost 25% babies die because of neonatal sepsis, and 50,000 of neonatal sepsis, almost 50,000 cases are attributable to resistance to first line of treatment of sepsis. So this was the driving force that led to India participating to the NEO-OP study, which Seamus mentioned. India was one of the 11 countries which participated in this study, and we found that Klebsiella pneumoniae and Acinetobacter caused most of the infections in these babies. There was almost 20% mortality in this group. 40% had culture positive sepsis. And almost 18 to 20% of the babies received carbapenem or colistin. Although they were all started on level 1 or 2 or 3 of WHO recommended guideline for sepsis, but very few when they were started on a higher generation antimicrobials were actually de-escalated. Most of them moved from one level to another, and almost 30% ended up receiving rather more than that, 50% ended up receiving the watch drugs of the drugs from the watch group of WHO classification, and almost 20% received carbapenem and colistin. So this is the reason that we need new drugs coming to India. And for that, ICMR will be working with GARDP for establishing new clinical trial sites. And India needs new drugs. We have the patients, we have good labs who can support these clinical trial sites. And we are working very closely with GARDP to achieve that. At the same time, we are also working with the regulators. We organized a very productive meeting with the EMA participating, with FDA participating, and luckily there is a consensus on the regulatory aspects of for introduction of new antimicrobials. So as I mentioned, looking for new drugs, developing new antimicrobials will be an important component of containment of antimicrobial resistance and addressing the same. Otherwise, antimicrobial resistance will affect the achievement of 18 targets across the 9 SDGs. This is dated information post-COVID. We have seen excessive use of broad-spectrum antimicrobials in our country. Most of the patients who were hospitalized received 75% of them received watch or the reserve drugs for the treatment. So it is a kind of a slow pandemic, and we should all brace up for the time ahead post-COVID. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kamini. And thank you all for your comments and perspectives. So while the audience is getting questions ready, I will start with a couple questions for our panel if everyone wants to turn their cameras on. But to the audience, please do submit your questions through the question window in the meantime. And Seamus, if you're ready, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
I think that, for me, the overarching question is thinking about the COVID pandemic and thinking about the lessons learned from the pandemic. A, what did we learn? What was, what are the key takeaways? And then secondly, B, are these lessons adaptable to the next global event? I think, from my perspective, really making sure that these lessons learned aren't just one-off is really critical, and that these ultimately are translatable so that our systems are resilient and our businesses have that continuity, Chris, that you spoke to during your comments. So Seamus, if you want to start with some of those lessons learned and whether or not these are going to ultimately be translatable the next time we face a crisis like COVID.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think I'm going to respond first on a sort of more personal perspective, and then maybe think about a more sort of broader response to the second part of your question. I do think that what I've sort of learned, and I think our team have learned, is really to listen. Is to listen to your partners, sites, organizations on the ground, to really understand the impact that they were finding early days and how it evolved, and then what they could do to actually introduce research and not sort of give a sort of overview or a helicopter view on, we think you can do this or we think you can't do that. And I think that I found that quite enlightening. The sort of, I could call it the creativity of sites within the regulatory framework was very impressive in terms of how they were dealing with, significant impact on their daily lives as individuals, but also their ability to do their work. And then they still thought about ways of being able to address clinical research. And also other partners not involved in clinical research. Again, that sort of creativity and willingness to try and overcome the hurdles and predict how they could deal with it in a sort of next wave. And the other things I would say is not to panic. Particularly there's a sort of a tendency initially to panic and don't push. It relates to my point around listening, is maybe not to push for answers and solutions and try to be patient, which is very difficult when you've got obviously governance and demands. You need to sort of make sure that you're able to think very carefully through the impact and what you can bring in realistically to address that. Be understanding and gain commitment, I think, is really key, and persevere, I think, is the other thing. No, I didn't want to repeat things I said when I presented, and Chris and Kamini mentioned those. I think going forward, I think what we have learned is how fragile our health systems are, and also this is like contradictory how robust they are in certain ways. But and I think particularly in the type of research that we're undertaking in infectious diseases, that how we need to make sure that we have the right resources to be able to ensure that we continue to evaluate treatments and not have them delayed too long, because I think that there is a need to keep moving forward and accelerating treatments for infections and other diseases which are as important, if not more important to some degree than COVID, if I can say that. And I think that prioritization, I think, is really important to do now before we get another sort of or future pandemics, is how do we actually protect how do we support the critical research that needs to happen in the area of bacterial infections and AMR, I think is really something that we need to learn. And I think what we're learning is to try and gain that commitment and support our partners to be able to commit to the ongoing research, which is a challenge, don't get me wrong, but I'll leave it there because I think I've spoken a lot on this.
Thank you. And just before I continue, if any of the other panelists ever want to chime in, I don't want these to be just, one question for everyone. So please chime in when you'd like to. Kamini, thinking about some of your comments and the way that you nicely spoke about drug development and some of the different activities going on in India, I'm interested to also hear from you as you think about how you talk about this messaging, and when you communicate within India, are you finding the political will you need to advance ICMR's agenda? Do people appreciate the threat of drug resistance in India? How are you thinking about both your work within ICMR as well as how to relate the issue of AMR within the broader political context?
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of things have changed in last 7-8 years. Antimicrobial resistance was always seen as microbiologists' problem. There was a disconnect between microbiologists and clinicians, and clinicians were not very keen to hear from microbiologists. So this was a situation some time back, but then as the whole AMR unfolded to a level where it became dangerous for the patients and it became challenging to save patients. Now we see a good connect, at least the hospitals that I work with, they are mainly tertiary care hospitals, but we see good teamwork between the microbiologists and the clinicians, because it is becoming challenging for clinicians to save their patients. If you're having a Klebsiella pneumoniae infection, which is 70% resistance to carbapenems, and you are looking, and the only option that you have is colistin to offer to that patient, it is not a very encouraging situation to be in. So tertiary care hospitals where there are ICUs and where you have very sick patients, a lot of things have changed. We now have a challenge of moving from tertiary care to the next level of healthcare, which is a secondary care, which that part is very challenging because the labs are not there. There are not enough physicians or microbiologists or clinical pharmacists to guide. So India has quite a few, I would say, human resource and infrastructure issues as well to address. But I mean, it has been a very, I would say a heartening journey for last 7-8 years. And a lot of things have changed towards positive. Now there's a lot of willingness. Every hospital wants to be part of ICMR network. There are many hospitals which are part of ICMR network where ICMR doesn't provide any funding. They have a accredited lab, they have everything. So they willingly contribute data to ICMR network. So this has been very encouraging, and I would like to definitely acknowledge some of the investigators that I work with who have been instrumental in creating this kind of a positive change among their peers, that most hospitals, they now feel inclined to be part of this initiative because the education and the trainings that we bring to them, they find useful. So this change is coming around. I would say it still has to percolate down to the next levels of healthcare.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up question because we got a question from the audience that I think relates to your comments. They asked whether or not ICMR supports education and awareness around AMR.
So you see, ICMR is a medical research organization. So our focus is different. We want to focus on the research aspects of AMR. Education and awareness is with the Ministry of Health, the National Center for Disease Control. It's a different agency. But one comment I would like to make here is that we still don't know, not much work has been done around what kind of messaging works with the education of masses, education of physicians. And this is a problem, I think, of all the low middle income countries, because we have a lot of healthcare being delivered through the private sector who are not part of any group, and there are standalone GPs or general physicians. So it is definitely a researchable area to customize the messaging as per the needs and as per the understanding of the masses in India. So this is something which I think India needs to work on.
Thank you. So Chris, I'll ask the next question of you. One of the things that I have heard a lot is that those of us who are working in the infectious disease space right now must feel so lucky because everyone now knows about infectious disease and there's going to be so much money flowing into this space, and investment isn't going to be a challenge anymore. So I would just like to pose this question to you. A, have you seen this renewed interest in infectious disease? Are you starting to see more expanded conversations? And I noticed the antiviral program in your portfolio and was just wondering if that inclusion is partly in response to the investor interest in the ID space.
Well, I would say that I would take the antiviral aside maybe for a moment, because I think there's a different swim lane for investment in antivirals. For antibiotics, I think that the COVID experience has alerted people to the risk, to the risk of being unprepared. Certainly, we feel more equity investor interest now than we did about 18 months ago, when sentiment was very negative on the back of a couple of bankruptcies in the space. Mm-hmm. I think what COVID highlighted for all the private companies that are pre-commercial, which is really the bulk of the people doing the R&D, is how fragile their business model is, because it's very difficult to withstand a 12 to 18 month delay due to something unexpected like COVID, which as Seamus pointed out, slowed down all the clinical trials, damaged the ability to import and export, and every part of the system was damaged in a way. And so suddenly companies that are living on the edge financially have to absorb a 12 or 18-month delay. And we've seen that many of the companies have really been fighting for their lives through this period. I think because of that, it slowly but surely it elevates the conversation. I mean, we've had 10 years of committees and meetings and statements saying somebody should do something. But I think the UK subscription model, which is hopefully being expanded in Europe, and then the Pasteur Act that was reintroduced in the US just in the last 2 weeks, which would also be a subscription model. These feel like there's momentum behind the idea that maybe we can't save everybody, but if we don't save anybody, that's not going to be a good idea. And so I guess I would say that it's slow, it's real, the renewed interest in the space, and I believe that the AMR Action Fund, which was a number of organizations, including Big Pharma, putting money into a pool for investment in new antibiotics. I think that's a critical step. And so these are all steps, that we think together could make it viable for at least a subset of the organizations to succeed and bring these antibiotics all the way to the finish line and beyond.
I think you raised some interesting questions, and I'm going to pose this question to all the panelists. I think one of my concerns is we have all this awareness and all these conversations right now about ID, and people are aware of it, but how do we keep this momentum from being a pendulum, right? That people feel like, okay, well, we tackled this issue and now let's forget about ID for a while. How do you think we as a community can keep, whether it's AMR or infectious diseases more broadly, on the radar and help continue to ensure that this isn't an issue that just kind of gets brushed under the table until the next crisis? Maybe Kamini, I'll start with you, or Seamus, if you'd like to start.
Oh, Kamini, go first.
Okay. So this is a challenge, always a challenge to keep the momentum going. Unless there is a lot of funding and a lot of push. That's what we saw when we had the HIV scores going on in the country. But then there was a lot of push and there was a lot of funding and a lot of willingness, I would say, at the part of the government to keep it going at a pace where we had to contain the epidemic. Similarly, now I think it is more the focus on overall development of healthcare infrastructure, investment in healthcare, investing in human resources. So that is something that I think we have all learned, especially in our countries and other low middle income countries where a very small part of GDP is actually invested into healthcare. But we do see a hope. India has already made a statement, our finance minister made a statement that India would be establishing infectious diseases blocks in all the district hospitals, which was needed, badly needed, I think, for many, many years. And it is a very positive change. Yet I think it is very important to keep bringing out data in public and publishing the data so that especially the linking it with the morbidity, mortality and the economics. Most of the time, for example, even for the drug-resistant infections, even I was not able to capture the clinical outcomes for drug-resistant infections in these tertiary care hospitals till now. But for COVID patients, we saw that out of all the patients who acquire secondary bacterial infections, 50% mortality was there in that group, which is a big number considering the total number of hospitalizations. Second aspect here is that when the patient is there longer in the hospital, is more likely to acquire hospital-acquired infections, and we need more investment in infection control at that point in time. So, I mean, I think linking, continue to bring out the impact of infectious diseases on the quality of life, the morbidity, mortality, and having the economics aspect. Linking all this will continue to, I think, keep the spotlight on infectious diseases and encourage more investment and keep the momentum going.
Thank you. Seamus, did you have something you wanted to
Yeah,
add
I
as
think
well?
Kamini's covered it really well, and all I would add is I think obviously we've seen that antibiotics are really key in terms of pandemic preparedness. Yes, they may have been used inappropriately in some instances during the pandemic, but are a key sort of cornerstone of our interventions against a pandemic, be it viral or bacterial. So I think it's important to see the relevance of antibiotics in that preparedness. I think what's really critical is to build on the point that Kamini said. I think one of the challenges we have is really to demonstrate the burden of disease linked to antibiotic resistance, antimicrobial resistance, and I think that is we're getting better there with the initiatives such as the Global Burden of Disease Estimate run out of Washington. And I think that's really something that needs to be supported at certain individual countries. And India's obviously been taking a lead on that with the work that Kamini's outlined. You know, I think if we look at the AMR action plans, national action plans, I think those action plans are such a big ask for countries to address. I think we need to support countries maybe focusing on a couple of key wins, which in my sort of bias would be to focus on burden of disease and really demonstrating how interventions make a difference, and they have a value to introduce an intervention, be that infection prevention control, be that prevention like vaccines or treatment. What is the value of those in reducing the burden of disease, or even an economic benefit or other key performance indicators, if I can use that phrase? I think that's what we really need to demonstrate, that type of evidence, which I think will then answer your point, Jennifer, in terms of keeping this high profile. Is I think people need to see more of that data, and I'm a bit concerned that we're still asking countries to do too much in terms of AMR action plans, and we should support them to with investment really to support them focusing on sort of key wins, if I can call it that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point about data, and Chris, you probably have perspective on this being in the US as well. I know that question about what is the true impact of antibiotic resistance here in the US, what are the true economic costs, have both supported some of the discussions around this issue at the political level, but also has led to some broader questioning about how much investment is really needed.
Yeah, it's funny because I was thinking about 2 points as we were speaking about this. One is at the level of burden of disease. You know, anecdotally, it's very interesting. I mean, there's always a lag between the reality and the perception. And so I can remember a few years ago participating in some qualitative market research where, you know, we are behind the mirror, so to speak, and a series of physicians were brought in for interviews, and each one carried their biogram from their hospital. And it would show, say, carbapenem resistance of 10%. And then you would say, do you have CRE? And they'd say, well, no, not in my institution. And then say, but 10% of your organisms are resistant to carbapenem. So almost by definition, you have CRE. And so there was this disconnect. And so I think we see this all the time. We're seeing it here with metallos in the United States. We talked to a physician recently who said, well, if there were metallos, I'd be reading about it, you know, on the front page of the New York Times, because typically if you get an outbreak, that's where it ends up. And so luckily, we don't have that problem. And then we do a little bit of research, and one center in Washington, D.C. had 45 incidences in the last 3 months. One center in New York had 30. You know, there's this disconnect that's happening between the reality on the ground and this perception that it's a problem. You know, it's sort of like the way we were about COVID in the beginning, which was, well, luckily it's over there. And it's not here, and then suddenly it's here, but it's on the West Coast. and then suddenly it's everywhere. And I believe there's this human nature thing to try to put it off and put it off. And so I think that leads to my second point, which is we're at a moment now where there's an opportunity to stop talking and complete an action. You know, again, in the US, there is the Pasteur Act. It's introduced, there's momentum, there's a big push going on to try to overcome the normal political, you know, sort of inertia and get it over the finish line. And I think it would make a big impact, But there's a limited amount of time to do it. You probably got about the next 6 to 12 months. And then we go into election cycles, et cetera, and everything falls apart again. And that's a real action that will completely move the ball. Just as I think this AMR Action Fund will move the ball. And so these actions have to happen. Because if they do, they make an impact, a real one. Maybe not for everybody, but for some people. And that's better than what we've got now, which is really just a lot of talk. So two things. I think there's a lack of recognition of the urgency of the matter. You know, there's a lack of recognition of what's actually happening because there's a lag. And secondly, there's an opportunity now to act. It's all set up, but we've got to push it over the finish line.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you all for your comments. And I think, Chris, your points about how do we move from another report. I think everyone on this call has probably read their fill of reports about this issue, but really thinking about how we translate that into action to ensure that we can start to address some of the significant public health impact of antibiotic resistance, but also ensure that some of these innovator drugs don't fall by the wayside due to lack of funding or lack of political will. I think I just want to thank Seamus and Kamini and Chris for your great conversation and the audience for participating in the webinar. For the audience to know, this webinar has been recorded, so it will be available on the GARDP website soon. Let's see if I can get back control over these slides. Okay, I'm going to have Astrid, can you? Thank you. I'm happy to announce that GARDP is launching a new webinar series this week, the AMR discussions. So please join us for an interesting panel on balancing access to and stewardship of antimicrobials and LMICs this Thursday. And you can find the registration link here on this slide. And thanks again to our speakers, and thanks for the audience for joining us today. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day or great rest of your evening, depending on where you're located. And thanks again to the panelists for joining this great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.